Imbento Lang.
Welcome to Imbento Lang, the show where we delve into the minds of Filipino inventors and innovators who have left an indelible mark on science and technology. I'm your host, Steve, and today we have the privilege of talking to none other than Mr. Roland Benzon. Roland is the patent author and co-founder of WIKA, a technology that lets people with hearing and/or visual disabilities enjoy movies, TV shows, and videos through augmented synchronized sign language, closed captions, or audio description. Roland has led WIKA's product development and has over 30 years of experience in software, mobile communications, IT and media, as well as international business development. Currently, WIKA is affiliated with the Ateneo Blue Nest program, where he engages with various stakeholders and clients in the public and private sector. Join us as we uncover the stories of Filipino inventors. This is Imbento Lang. Stay tuned for our conversation with Mr. Roland Benzon. Hi, Sir Roland. Welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today, despite your busy schedule.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to dive into my list of questions. Is that all right?
Yes.
I know I briefly introduced you earlier to our listeners, but could you tell me more about yourself and how you were able to come up with your invention?
Okay, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this program, Imbento Lang. I suppose I qualify, considering that I have like 5 or 6 granted patents with my name on it, and then maybe another dozen or so that I co-authored, but no credits. So I'm glad to be here. Now, back to your question. In the process, actually, this particular innovation for people with hearing and or visual disabilities came to me while I was writing a patent 10 years ago. When you write a patent, you're supposed to describe uses for your invention, your innovation, and other potential uses. So as I was writing that, I thought of potential use for people with disability or language accessibility. But I did not document that. I said, okay, that's a subject of another patent, another invention, some other day. So 10 years later, or maybe not 10 years later, 5 years later, I created a different startup specifically for language accessibility. And specifically for people with hearing and or visual disabilities, it's partly inspired by family members with disabilities. I probably learned initially very basic sign language, because I have family, deaf relative. But that relative moved away, so lack of practice, but, always in the back of my mind to improve the communication or accessibility for people with disabilities. So that's it in a nutshell.
So how were you able to come up? Was there any instance that you said, hey, this is a good opportunity that I'd like to, take advantage of or solve a problem to? How are you able to come up with, from that, you were writing your previous patent to now working on or developing like an augmented reality or like a sign language app for, these people?
Well, partly because my previous patent, I managed to commercialize that, monetize that. It was a gaming patent or a broadcast media gaming patent. So that aired on TV5, like a massively multiplayer TV gaming for 5 years called Moneyball. But when our last season, our contract ended, I looked into doing other things. So this idea was still in the back of my mind. It was initially, and partly the reason why it's called WIKA is WIKA, as we all know, stands for language, right? So my next project was going to be a language accessibility service. Basically, the tagline or the pitch was lets people enjoy movies, TV shows, and videos in their own language. So you can watch a Japanese movie in Tagalog or vice versa, right? So at any to any language. And then, so I one of the inventions that I patented was a set-top box, which we called SubHub. And SubHub was a set-top box. You plug in an HDMI video, and it outputs the same video, but already subtitled in the language that you prefer. Okay, so in goes a video without subtitle, out goes a video with subtitles. So when I demoed it to a deaf family member or a the sister of the deaf relative, I was informed that the first language of the profoundly deaf is sign language. I did not know that. I thought they all can read captions. But I learned that most people, most profoundly deaf, not only Filipinos, but most profoundly deaf people around the world cannot read. So I was shocked by that. So their first tongue, the first language they learn, which kind of makes sense, right? Because we don't go to school, learn how to read until we're 5. In the meantime, what language do you speak at home? If you're not hearing, you can't speak. So you sign is your first language, right? But many Filipinos and many deaf people around the world don't go to school. Why? Because if you grew up in 𝗚𝗂𝗀𝘁𝘁, somewhere in Negros, you're like 100 kilometers from the nearest deaf school or nearest special education school. That's if your parents can even afford to send you or will let you, live far away. So 90%, more than 90% of profoundly deaf kids do not have access to formal education. So long story short, what initially started out as a language accessibility kind of micro-pivoted towards deaf and blind accessibility or accessibility for people with hearing and or visual disabilities. So initially, that's our focal point because it's a largely underserved community, underserved market. So no one really is giving them much attention outside of the first world countries. In first world countries, you have strong accessibility laws. If you're in the US, you're lucky because you have ADA, American Disability Act, where they're very strict. And companies are penalized for non-compliance. In the rest of the world, if you have disability, it's a tougher life. Anyway, so initially the innovation, the invention was a bit broader for language accessibility, and we will continue to pursue that. But initially, because limited resources when you're your startup, we decided to focus on the deaf, hard of hearing, blind, and low vision. So
how important is it for people with hard of hearing or people with visual disabilities to gain access to mainstream media?
Well, I think mainstream media is sort of good for information, but I think, when you're young, you don't really care about mainstream media. You care about animation and cartoons and, kid stuff. So I think the first thing is just education.
Okay.
Right? If you're lucky, you can learn how to read because you went to a special education school or a deaf school, or their mother tongue is sign language. So that's what you learn first. And if you're lucky, you go to a deaf school where they teach you using sign language. They teach you how to read and write. So that gives you more skills to kind of cope with the sighted and hearing world, right? So that's probably most important, the ability to read, right? Because if you want to be integrated with the that kind of world, then that's a useful skill. The access to media, it comes later. And sadly, there's no access to media. If you're, for instance, if you're Pinoy profoundly deaf, how do you consume media, right? If you go to the cinema, it's free to go to the cinema because people with disabilities have free access. But how do you consume the movie? If the movies don't have captions, right? For most hearing Pinoys, captions are distracting in the movie theater, so they don't want it. So it's not accessible to the reading deaf. What about the non-reading deaf or the illiterate deaf? So there's no access. If they can't access that, chances are they can't access TV, because by law, I think only 5% of broadcast television is mandated to be captioned. And if it's captioned and you can't read, tough luck. It's very little is in sign language. Okay, so it's inaccessible. Mainstream media, news and information, education. If you're lucky and you can read, at least there's Netflix or some other online media with captions, right? But most local media don't.
Sure. Thus, the birth of your invention. Could you briefly describe us what features or how can now disabled people access these media?
Okay, our solution is a form of augmented reality. So it's multifaceted. We have an app. We have augmented reality wearables, such as what I'm holding now. Okay, so but that's for the deaf and hard of hearing. We also have solutions for the blind and low vision. Okay, so let's talk about the app. What the app does is, first of all, it detects what you're watching. Let's say you're watching Barbie or Oppenheimer, right, in the movie theater. It detects that you're watching Oppenheimer, and then let's say I go into the movie. I'm deaf. Our app detects that you're watching Oppenheimer. You put on this glass, and in this glass you can see the screen. It's translucent, but you can also see sign language projected in this glass. So it layers the sign language over what you're seeing. So it's like an inset. So our technology identifies what you're watching and then delivers synchronized sign language for the profoundly deaf, captions for the hard of hearing, audio description for the blind and visually impaired. Audio description is different. In case the listeners now aren't familiar, audio description is just like a dub track. It's an audio track that describes non-dialogue scenes. Obviously, if you're blind, you can hear the conversation. But if there's no conversation, you don't know what's going on. So audio description describes the non-dialogue scenes. For instance, oh, Steve is walking down the hall. He opened the door.
Sure.
He went into the studio, turned on the lights. He sat and set up the microphone. You know, that sort of thing. That's audio description. So we also have that. In fact, we're working with a group called Project Adam. It's a coalition of different organizations serving Filipino blind and low vision communities. ADAM stands for Audio Description Awareness Movement. So we had a meeting, I think last month, with MTRCB, you know, to kind of push the agenda of making TV and movies more accessible to the blind. And of course, we successfully demonstrated to MTRCB the WIKA solution for the blind and low vision. There are more Pinoys who are hard of hearing and deaf, but we serve both. It just depends on which community we're engaging with.
Quite a revolutionary product, if I should say so myself. At this point, I'd like you to describe what were the steps you've taken to kind of like produce your first prototype?
Well, you know, if you have aspirations for IP protection, first and foremost is you document it. There's a template, you answer a bunch of questions, and then you file a provisional patent application, right? That way, immediately you're protected in the 140 plus member nations of the PCT. That's like all the countries that have IP laws.
Even though you haven't still produced your rough prototype?
Well, you could produce the prototype first privately, but technically or ideally you shouldn't disclose it to anyone.
Sure.
Until you've already documented and you've filed for some kind of IP protection. If you care about IP protection. If you don't, then just do it. Just develop your prototype and you know, test it with the market and hope that it works. So going back, so it could go. Obviously, patent applications cost. So it might make sense for you to develop your MVP, develop your prototype, make sure it works, make sure there's a market, and test it with users privately, unless you have NDAs with them. And then if it works, then maybe it's worth filing a patent for, because those are expensive. It's a little cheaper in the Philippines, maybe 150,000 pesos, but in the U.S. it'll probably cost you $5,000 to $10,000 for the provisional patent. So so that's the process. In terms of the actual prototyping, software prototyping obviously is a little bit easier and faster. You can iterate quickly and many times and frequently. Hardware is a bit more difficult. So in our case, we sometimes it's easier to just buy components and then just kind of enhance it or tweak it. Like our initial prototypes were existing hardware that we rewrote the software or the firmware of that hardware to suit our particular needs. So yeah, so that could be a fast way of prototyping. But we also have very raw prototypes, as in, you know, you buy different component boards. You know, they have these development hardware kits that you can buy online, and you put things together, so to speak, until you have something that's workable. Then maybe you work on designing something that's more for, you know, final product, or at least not a bunch of loose wires and loose circuit boards. Anyway, but that's generally it. And of course, you iterate it. This particular AR glass that I'm wearing is our third version.
Mm-hmm.
Our first version only had one sort of inset display on the right eye, but I realized when we were testing it with the deaf is some of them prefer captions. So, you know, captions, you want to see it with kind of both eyes, right? Not just one eye. If it's sign language, maybe we're kind of used to the sign language interpreter being on one corner on the screen. So anyway, make a long story short, you iterate based on feedback, mm-hmm. right? So when we first developed our version 1, it was sign language specific, but some people said, well, we prefer sign language and with captions. So we developed like a full screen or both, or binocular, so to speak, or stereoscopic solution as opposed to monoscopic. Anyway, so version 2 was a lighter version, a cheaper version. Mm-hmm. So that's another criteria, which is affordability. Our first version it worked, but it was a bit more expensive. So our second version is a lot cheaper, probably less than $50. And then this is our third version. This is more expensive, a few $100s, but a lot more immersive. So a lot more high resolution, can do a lot more things. Our fourth version, which we're working on, does not require a smartphone. So you could just go to the cinema, put it on, kind of like a 3D glass, and you don't need a smartphone with it.
And all these iterations were based on user feedback.
Some were actual user feedback, some were imagined user feedback. For instance, version 4, I already kind of anticipated that some people do not, it kind of makes sense, right? I mean, it's somewhat intuitive or maybe common sense to anticipate or to expect that most people would rather not have to connect their smartphone to the solution. Because the movie, it's like a 3D glass. When you go to the movie and watch a 3D movie, you just put on the glass. You don't have to plug it into anywhere, right? So less moving parts, less issues, less wires dangling, and less, this and that. So that one is imagined. So I just expect people to prefer.
But I think since you're down to your fourth prototype already, I think it's because you've already gotten an understanding of what the users really need at that point already. How does having to learn more about these people or your users, your potential users, your customers, influence the design of the products? Because you mentioned earlier, you've also dabbled on tweaking the designs of your products. So how does design affect these potential customers of yours?
How do designs affect potential customers, or the other way around?
Or the other way around, yes.
I think it's there's a virtuous cycle, right? I mean, and different strokes for different folks. Some people can afford a $300 item, so it's more fully featured. Some wear glasses, right, like you. So you would want something that complements your prescription glasses, right, as opposed to wearing a glass over a glass, right? So there are different factors. So, you keep on iterating. The first feedback, okay, you refine it, and then you learn something new, perhaps a different market, a different use case. The home use case is different from the cinema use case. At home, you don't have to deal with privacy, meaning you're not bothering the moviegoer next to you, right? If you hold up an iPad with sign language, it's okay. But if you did that in the movie theater, you would be annoying the person sitting next to you. Sure. So you will be distracting them. So those are some of the considerations. There are many, many factors. So, but I think it works both ways. It's sort of, virtuous cycle. So feedback impacts the design. The design also kind of impacts the users. It might change them. It might change their behavior. It might change their attitude.
Were there any surprising insights during this iteration process that you've discovered?
Well, for me, the most shocking one was, I developed the set-top box, patented it and prototyped it and got it to work. And then in less than 10 seconds, it was shut down and was slammed like, no.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because the set-top box overlaid captions over the video. But in less than 10 seconds, I was told that captions are not good enough because most profoundly deaf people cannot read. So, you develop a solution and then you realize, oh man, it didn't fit. Or you assumed it fit,
right.
But it didn't actually. So that was the shocking insight from a user feedback. So we had to go to bed a bit upset because of the time and resources spent, and then you realize you know you were misguided by your own sort of assumptions. And then I went to bed. The next day I had the solution worked up, so I drafted the next version. I went to bed, it's just churning in my head. It's like, how do I solve this? How do I solve this? Until I fell asleep. And then by the time I woke up, I guess I had figured it out, maybe in my dreams. So I started working on the second version. So that was probably one of the first insights. The second was something I researched on the web to validate that. I found out that actually on the web, 98% of profoundly deaf students or deaf kids do not have access to formal education. So chances are those 2% live in first world countries, because they have access. Just like in the Philippines, most profoundly deaf kids who can read and write probably live in the big cities, Metro Manila, because there are deaf schools, there are special education programs. But if you live out in the boondocks, if you live out in the outskirts, in the provinces, you probably have no access.
You wouldn't have access to these.
So hopefully we could be a way to facilitate access. The other thing that I learned, again, researching, in the Philippines, there's a law that requires that all municipalities in the country, there's like 1,400, 1,500 cities and municipalities in the country, 1,500. Barangays, 14,000 or something like that. That all the municipalities are required by law to have special education centers for people with learning disabilities, not just blind, deaf, but learning disabilities, spectrum spectrum challenges, right? Autism and ADHD and all different, divergent, or what's that?
The neurodivergent.
Neurodiverse is the proper word. Thank you. There's supposed to be a facility for them, right? But 84% of the municipalities in the country are not complying with that law. So you're talking about 84% of people or children or people with disabilities have no way of access to special education or even learning centers. The learning center is even different from schools. Learning centers are a bit more loose. They're not structured K-12 programs. They might just be, kind of like complementary learning centers or training materials, just access.
Then after your research, you then proceeded to prototyping.
No, I think the research came first. I think some of the research, the market research regarding 84% just showed to me or gave me the idea that there's a huge underserved market, and that it also told me that, hey, whatever we do can impact a lot of people because 80%, 84%, 90% don't. So we can impact the lives of many, many. If you want to know global stats, as of maybe 2-3 years ago, 466 million people around the world are deaf or hard of hearing. 253 million are blind or visually impaired. So altogether, that's 700 plus million. By 2030, that's going to be close to 1 billion.
It's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people, right? So we're starting here in the Philippines because it's home base for me. But but we're hopefully this year is our breakout year. Not only in the Philippines but also the rest of the world. So, so there.
Earlier, you've mentioned you've touched on your innovation process, your creativity process on coming up with the different versions of your invention, right? So, has this always been the steps that you took? You first validated the idea, you do market research afterwards, and then you actually do the physical, tangible prototype, right? Has this always been your way?
No, I don't think that linearly. I think many ideas, it's very haphazard. Sometimes the functionality comes first, right? The functionality.
Sure.
What's the functional, what do you want to accomplish is accessibility, right? Give access. And then what form will that take? So conceptual first, right? Access. What's the problem? What's the solution? What's the benefit, right? What's the functionality? How do you achieve that? You can achieve it via software. You can achieve it via hardware. You can achieve it combination. How do you scale? Those things are, so it's not linear. It's not sequential. Particularly if you're a creative that's untrained like me. I didn't go to industrial design or, I had some engineering education, but creativity comes from different inspirations, different, if you're a loose thinker, it can come from anywhere. And I am kind of loose that way.
And it has worked for your benefit, right?
Yes and no. I think loose is good for creativity, but it can also be challenging because loose can also mean lack of focus.
Sure.
Right? So that's a challenge.
For listeners who might be on the brink of their own creative discovery, what advice could you offer to them?
Okay. Here's one that I was told recently. I participated in a speed dating, like an investment speed dating session. It's not speed dating. It's like speed pitching. So basically you have 2 minutes or 2 minutes to pitch your idea to 10 different investors. Right? So each investor, hears or listens to maybe 10 or 15 different startups in a span of 30 minutes or something. And two of the investors that I met with gave me this feedback. He said, out of the 10 or 12 startups that I heard today, yours is the only one that's solving a real problem.
Wow, that must have been so good to hear.
Yeah, I mean, but I also have to acknowledge that before I got here, I also had other startups that were not as impactful. So I'm not saying that I'm the holy grail or I'm like the messiah. In a way, you need a bit of luck for this kind of epiphany of this kind of idea to come to you and for you to even respond to it. Because most people would be like, what? There's no money there. Why would I want to serve people with disabilities? It's like 1% of the market, right? I could be making millions with the 99% selling, shopping stuff, right? Or, So it takes a bit of a grace to have open mind, to have open ears for those ideas to come to you and for you to embrace them is another level of grace. So I'm thankful and lucky to be old enough to kind of get to that point where, when we're young, we're just like, oh, we want to make it, we want to succeed, and we want to achieve this status and whatever, right? Which is fine. I went through that too. Through that phase. So in saying that, it felt good, but I also recognized that it's, it wasn't, being the best or being, is also partly circumstantial. So going back to that, so my point is, what's the advice? Is try to look for real problems to solve. Because many of the ideas out there, many of the innovations or even, startups are, I don't know how best to phrase it without being condescending or disparaging, but it's sort of a consumerist. They all, as I think from the movie Boxing, anyway, with Brad Pitt and
Fight Club.
Fight Club, that's it, right? Thank you. See, this is a conversation, right? So with yeah.
What's your point?
My point is there was a quote there by the author. He says, you know, people are always selling you stuff you don't need so you can impress people you don't like, blah, blah, blah. So it's sort of like that with a lot of consumerist ideas. Yeah. They just want to sell you stuff. And again, nothing wrong with that. I think, you know, there's a place for that. Some do solve solutions, some do solve problems such as inefficiencies and hassles and all of that. But is it really solving a real problem? I mean, there are 17 SDG goals set by the United Nations, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They, you know, perhaps people who are looking to come up with ideas can start with those. Just look at those goals. See if you can come up with ideas for sustainability, for uplifting, for inclusion, for reducing inequalities, SDG number 10, for quality education, SDG number 4, you know, and
you
so
know
on.
Your SDGs, wow.
Right. So, you know, I don't know all of them. I'm familiar with some of them, especially the ones that relate to what we do most. But that's a good start to, you know, to take a crack at.
Yeah.
Another is just be open, just soak it in, soak everything in. Solutions often come from connecting the dots, and the dots could be your skill in many, you know, multifaceted skill, you know, creative, not just very narrow silo skill. Of course, there are opportunities there too, you know, for the specialists that only focus on a very niche or very vertical kind of space or area. So, and some might, you know, and also persevere. I mean, I'm a serial entrepreneur, so I've had a lot of pains to go with a lot of the successes as well. So, you know, I think I read a quote recently that Usain Bolt, you know, trained 4 years, you know, to run 10 seconds, right? So it's kind of like that.
That's a good analogy.
Except, you know, startups could be longer, right? You know, it might take 5-10 years for things to come into fruition, or for even, if you're lucky, you might even get an exit or rewarded.
So persevere.
Yeah, persevere. Yeah. You know, so.
Well, it has been a fascinating conversation with you, Sir Roland. Before we end, are there any upcoming projects or inventions you're currently working on that you want to put out there?
I could tell you, but then I'd have to. No, I'm kidding. Well, I am pleased to share that our inventions, there's every 2 years, the DTI, Department of Trade and Industry, and its affiliate Design Center of the Philippines holds a kind of like a pseudo competition. It's more like it's an awards program. It recognizes design awards in 5 categories: objects, systems and processes, and a few other categories.
Yeah. All
design categories. We applied, and you can apply to 2 maximum categories, and we were shortlisted for the 2 categories that we applied for, which is object design, which includes this augmented reality wearable, and also systems and process design. So we're a finalist, so to speak. So we're looking forward to that, and if we get lucky, then maybe we'll come back and do another Imbento again. Talk about that. We were also shortlisted by the Department of Science and Technology for a grant. Not done yet, but I think we're 90+% there. Fingers crossed. That said, this is some of the things that we're working on. AI. We did not mention AI. So AI for accessibility. Okay, I won't give you specifics, but we'll have AI for sign language. Maybe not in full blown yet, but we definitely, part of our deliverables is a prototype for sign language learning, care of AI. So it will help students who want to learn sign language score themselves, or sort of like there's a teacher, there's an AI teacher scoring them or telling them whether what they're signing is correct or not. Okay, so that's one. Nothing special there. We can even open source that because that's a learning tool, right?
Sure.
So, but we have other more proprietary AI stuff that we're developing also for both accessibility and language in general. So, but you probably won't see that for, and I definitely would not show a prototype. We might do a prototype before the end of the year of the AI learning sign language platform. Just part of our progress report. Maybe not publicly, but privately with, like AIPO, Ateneo Intellectual Property Office, we could definitely show, because we are an incubatee and we would love to show our progress. And lots of things happening. So hopefully this is our breakout year. We are setting up partnerships and subsidiaries in the UK, Australia, US, India is a huge market. So if anybody here is listening, and we could partner in other markets or even in provinces, because, it takes a village. Right? So it takes a village. And so we're looking for partners everywhere. Like I said, 84% of the country doesn't have special education.
Exciting times, very exciting times for WIKA and for you. And with this, I'd like to thank you again for being with us and having this conversation. Truly, it was a very fascinating and interesting talk with you, Sir Roland. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great day.
Thank you.